In the Soviet Union, the grocery store was never just a place to buy food. It was a battlefield of expectations and contradictions. The system promised plenty. From the walls of every school and every office, posters beamed down messages of abundance: golden loaves of bread, thick red sausages, radiant milkmaids pouring endless buckets of milk. Soviet citizens were raised to believe in this dream, that the socialist economy would outpace the capitalist one, that production would grow ceaselessly, and that everyone would have what they needed. The art was dazzling. The slogans were confident. The future was near. But the moment you stepped through the doors of an actual Soviet grocery store, something shifted. The myth cracked. Outside, a cold wind. Inside, colder silence. The lights were harsh and flickering. The shelves were often half full, and even that was on a good day. You didn't walk into a store with a plan. You walked in with a question: what's there today? The answer changed by the hour. Sometimes there was cabbage, sometimes there wasn't. Sugar might appear once a month. Meat was a holiday luxury. Even basic staples, butter, flour, salt, felt like prizes in a lottery. No one planned meals, they planned survival. People bought what they saw, not what they needed. If there were canned tomatoes, you took 5. If a shipment of smoked fish arrived, you joined the line whether you liked fish or not. You never knew when you'd see it again. Still, the propaganda continued. Television anchors spoke proudly about growth. Newspapers printed charts of record-breaking harvests and factory outputs. But everyone knew those numbers had nothing to do with what sat, or didn't sit, on their local store's shelves. This dissonance became the background noise of daily life. You heard one thing and saw another. The worker in the poster beamed with pride. The woman in the store frowned, arms crossed, eyes scanning the empty refrigerated case. Even children learned to notice the gap. They memorized the bright colors of cereal boxes in imported cartoons, then walked past rows of gray cardboard packages at home. For the party leadership, the illusion had to be maintained. Grocery stores were staged for foreign visitors. Special shops existed where everything appeared normal, clean, stocked, Western. But those weren't for the people. Those were for the image. For the rest of the country, the daily routine was something between scavenging and hoping. Lines formed before sunrise. Rumors spread like wildfire. They're delivering butter today. Bananas are in at Leninsky Prospect. No one trusted official schedules. No one believed in inventory lists. What mattered was whispers, hints, knowing someone who knew someone. And still, you showed up. You waited. Sometimes, after 3 hours, the doors opened, and there was nothing. But no one shouted. No one rebelled. The disappointment was quiet, shrugged shoulders, tired eyes. It was just another day in the workers' paradise. A paradise with posters full of bread, and shelves that couldn't match them. At 5 in the morning, when the streets were still soaked in night and the city barely stirred, the first figures would appear. Bundled in thick coats, scarves wrapped twice around their heads, they shuffled through the frost toward the store entrance. They didn't come for leisure, they came for necessity. Because in the Soviet Union, if you weren't early, you were often left with nothing. Scarcity shaped everything, and the early hours became a kind of survival mechanism. The grocery store was not just a place, it was a test. Every morning, a quiet race began, not for luxury, just for basics. There were no official announcements, no store schedules, no certainty, only rumors. Someone's cousin said sugar was coming. A neighbor whispered that sausages had been spotted being unloaded behind the main warehouse. Nobody ever confirmed anything, but everyone acted as if it were true. Because if the rumor turned out to be right and you weren't there, you might go another month without that item. It didn't matter that you had work later or children to take to school. You rearranged your life around the line. When people arrived, they marked their place in silence. A string bag tied to the railing, a stool left by the wall, a handwritten number on a scrap of paper. These were more than objects. They were claims, declarations of presence. The queue had rules, unspoken, but strict. You did not skip. You did not question the numbers. You asked who was last, then stood behind them and became part of the organism. It was alive, this line, fluid, tense, watching itself. Old women, veterans of the system, held multiple places at once. Young mothers came with strollers, hoping for milk. Men usually stood for vodka or meat. Everyone watched the store entrance like hawks. When the delivery truck appeared, things changed. Tension crackled, eyes narrowed, posture shifted. The line, once calm, became alert. Someone whispered, "It's sugar." Someone else replied, "No, I saw sausage." Then came the jostling, the quiet push forward. People didn't run, not exactly, but they drifted closer, inch by inch. There were no loud arguments, only sharp elbows and urgent eyes. The workers inside the store rarely gave answers. Sometimes they just shook their heads or shrugged. They were exhausted too. If the doors opened, the ritual surged into its next phase. Entry was controlled. Only 5 at a time, maybe 10. You stepped into the fluorescent-lit cold and looked around. If what you hoped for was there, you grabbed it. If not, you bought something anyway, because walking out empty-handed felt like failure. Sometimes fights broke out over the last piece of cheese. Sometimes people just walked away quietly, bitter but unsurprised. And yet, in this strange choreography of waiting, people found rhythm. They talked, swapped stories, shared warnings. Sometimes they joked. Strangers who met in line became familiar faces. Others became enemies after a small act of queue cutting. The line created its own community, fragile, temporary, but real. It was more than a queue. It was life distilled into hours of standing, hoping, watching, and waiting for something, anything, to arrive. The first thing you noticed when stepping inside a Soviet grocery store was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. No soft music playing in the background, no cheerful announcements or advertising jingles. Just the dull hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of boots on linoleum. Conversations, if they happened at all, were hushed and brief. Voices dropped in volume, as if the store itself demanded silence. There was no laughter, no energy, only a kind of suspended tension, like everyone was waiting for something that hadn't come. The walls were usually a fading shade of gray or dull green, chipped in places, with flaking paint near the corners. There were no posters, no signs pointing you toward aisles of abundance. Most stores didn't even bother with signs at all. You were expected to know where things were, or where they were supposed to be. Half the shelves were empty. The other half held what seemed like the same 5 items repeated over and over. Jars of pickled cucumbers stacked 3 rows deep, cans of fish with generic white labels, rows of mustard, always mustard, collecting dust no one bothered to clean. If there was soap, it came in brownish blocks and smelled of chemicals. Toothpaste? Maybe, but not every week. The meat section was often a performance without a lead actor. The counter was there, the scale was there, the cashier too, but meat? That depended. Sometimes a grayish lump wrapped in paper. Other times, nothing at all. Yet the butcher still stood there, motionless behind a glass display case that held more fingerprints than product. Milk was kept behind the counter, if it had arrived at all. It came in thick glass bottles, often unsealed, with a yellowish layer of cream floating on top. Some bottles were chipped at the rim. Others had traces of yesterday's milk still crusted inside. Bread was a category unto itself. If it was there, people bought as much as they could carry. Loaves sat behind wooden counters, not wrapped in plastic, but stacked loosely in piles. White bread was rare, rye more common. Stale bread wasn't discounted, it was just reality. People brought their own bags, their own wrapping, because the store offered none. You picked your loaf, nodded to the cashier, paid in silence, and left. There were no brands, no options, just bread or no bread. The cashiers were like statues, trained in boredom. No greetings, no smiles, just a hand reaching for your money and another sliding your purchase across a worn metal surface. You didn't ask questions. You didn't complain. The cashier didn't care, and there was no manager to speak to. Sometimes you left without getting what you wanted. Sometimes you left with something you didn't need, but bought anyway because it was there. And through it all, the flickering lights, the bare shelves, the silence, there was a sense of resignation. Not anger, not outrage, just the heavy normalcy of it all. This was not a crisis. This was the everyday. This was what a grocery store looked like. Not a place of choice, not a place of plenty. Just a space, a quiet, colorless, waiting space. Behind the stillness of Soviet grocery stores, behind the empty shelves and silent queues, there was another world. Invisible to most, but absolutely vital. It was the world of connections. In the USSR, it had a name everyone understood: blat. It meant influence, favors, access, the unspoken system that greased the wheels of daily survival. Officially, all citizens were equal under socialism. In reality, everything depended on who you knew. Store managers were not simply employees, they were gatekeepers, guardians of scarce goods, and often the most important person in the neighborhood. While the front shelves remained bare, the storeroom in the back told a different story. There, hidden behind locked doors, were the real treasures. Crates of tangerines, boxes of chocolates, wheels of cheese, sausages still warm from the factory. These items almost never reached the general public. They were held, set aside for those who mattered: the friends, the relatives, the ones with the right phone numbers or the right last names. If you were lucky enough to know someone behind the counter, you didn't wait in line. You walked in through the side entrance, you said a quiet hello, slipped a package into their hand, maybe coffee from abroad, maybe a bottle of Armenian brandy, and walked out with a full bag. It wasn't corruption, at least not in the way people talk about it in the West. It was simply how things worked. Everyone understood. Everyone participated. Survival demanded it. Warehouse workers had their own kind of power. They saw shipments before anyone else. They knew when the butter would arrive, how much sugar came in, whether the canned meat would go to store hash 12 or hash 18. A friendly nod, a carton of cigarettes, a small favor, and you'd get a whisper, "Come tomorrow, early." That information was gold. People passed it down to trusted friends, but never too many. If the wrong person found out, the whole opportunity vanished. Code words became currency. "Do you have the special tea?" might mean coffee. "Anything fresh today?" Could be an inquiry about sausage. You learned to speak in this coded language, never directly, never in front of strangers. The wrong question at the wrong time could close doors. Better to be cautious. Better to imply than to ask. Some people turned their homes into unofficial distribution hubs. A dentist's wife had a cousin in the bakery. A teacher's brother worked at a poultry plant. Quietly, informally, goods changed hands. Prices weren't fixed. Sometimes money wasn't even involved. It was all about mutual benefit. I help you now, you help me later. A favor returned 3 months from now, a sack of potatoes in exchange for a winter coat. It was an economy without receipts, without taxes, without records. But it ran parallel to the official one, and often worked better. The irony was sharp. The Soviet state built entire ministries to plan food production, transportation, and distribution. It held meetings, issued 5-year goals, celebrated quotas, but the real mechanism of provision was this quiet network of favors and deals. Not everyone could access it. Those without connections, the elderly, the newcomers, the ones who didn't know how to ask, they stood in line, hoping. The rest used blat. And in that shadow system, status wasn't determined by your job title or education, but by the strength of your network and the subtlety of your negotiation. Power, in the end, was not in ideology. It was in access. There were things in Soviet grocery stores you could always find, not because they were needed, not because people wanted them, but because the system kept producing them, endlessly, regardless of demand. These items lined the shelves like a strange joke repeated too often. Pickled herring in plastic buckets sat by the entrance, their lids slightly bulging, the brine sloshing when moved. No one knew why there was so much of it. Maybe because fish was patriotic, or maybe because no one wanted to deal with the smell. Still, it was there, row after row, an ocean's worth of herring in every store from Leningrad to Vladivostok. Next to the fish, peas, canned, dull green, mushy. The labels never changed, a single line of text, a tiny graphic of a pea pod, and that was it. You didn't buy them for a meal. You bought them because they filled a space in the cupboard and made it look like you had options. Sometimes people joked that the peas were older than the shelves they stood on. No one laughed very hard. Then came the mustard. Jars upon jars, stacked 3 levels deep. Sharp, yellow, bitter. It wasn't the kind you spread gently on bread. It burned your nose, made your eyes water. Yet, it was always available, as if someone had once ordered an infinite supply and forgotten to cancel the request. Mustard became a symbol. You could walk into a store with completely empty shelves and still find mustard. It was a cruel kind of reliability. Other products came and went according to no logic. Salt sometimes disappeared for months, then reappeared in heaps. Matches, one day gone from every kiosk in the district, would suddenly flood the stores until people started using them as doorstops. But there were some things that never came. Not in quantity, not in quality, not at all. Toilet paper was a myth. If it arrived, it vanished in minutes. People learned to reuse newspapers, cut up old books, or simply go without. When real rolls appeared, they were kept like valuables, hidden in closets or gifted on special occasions. Baby food was another absence. Young mothers stood in line for hours, hoping to find formula. Most ended up feeding their children whatever they could grind into a puree. Fresh fruit was nearly foreign. Bananas were an event. Oranges came once a year, if that, and were distributed with the solemnity of medals. Apples, depending on the region, might appear more often, but even then, they were bruised, mottled, uneven in shape. Grapes were exotic. Lemons were medicine. You didn't eat them, you boiled them, made tea, and saved the peel for later. There was always an imbalance. The shelves looked full only if you didn't look too closely. A dozen rows of one item did not mean choice. It meant overproduction, planning errors, or simply indifference. People wandered the aisles not searching for what they needed, but scanning for anything out of the ordinary. A new label, a rare delivery, a familiar item in an unfamiliar place. In a system where demand didn't matter, the absurd became the norm. The stores told a story, but it was never about abundance or efficiency. It was about repetition, misallocation, and silent bewilderment. 1,000 jars of mustard. No soap. Barrels of vinegar. No baby diapers. The people adapted. They joked. They learned to live with it. But deep down, everyone knew. A store that could not provide the basics, but always had fish paste and canned carrots, was more than inefficient. It was a mirror of everything else. While most Soviet citizens lined up in the freezing dark for a chance at margarine or a half loaf of bread, a different kind of grocery store existed in another part of the city. Unmarked, guarded, and carefully hidden from public view. These were not the people's stores. They were for the few, the trusted, the important. Members of the nomenklatura, high-ranking party officials, directors of factories, KGB officers, senior military, shopped there without lines, without ration cards, and without the exhausting uncertainty that defined everyday life for everyone else. If the average Soviet store was a place of absence, these elite stores were a showcase of presence. There was no sign above the door. Sometimes it was behind a discreet gate, sometimes through a side alley near a government building. You needed a pass, usually issued by a ministry, to even be let in. Not just anyone could wander in and browse. There were guards, quiet, unsmiling, and a register of names. If your name wasn't on it, you walked away. But if you belonged, the doors opened into another world. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed but warm. The lights worked. The floors were clean. The shelves were full. Everything that was missing elsewhere could be found here. Sausages hung in long loops behind glass cases, freshly smoked and glistening, whole hams wrapped in paper, butter in golden foil, fresh eggs, cream, cheese, items the average citizen might only see on New Year's Eve, if ever. Chocolates from Bulgaria, canned ham from Hungary, bottles of Armenian brandy, Georgian wine, vodka in thick glass bottles with embossed labels. And not just local goods. Western imports sat alongside them. Swiss coffee, French sardines, Coca-Cola, even packages of real chewing gum. These weren't displayed to impress. They were just there. Normal. The clerk spoke politely. They weighed things carefully, wrapped them with care, made quiet conversation. They knew their customers by name. There was no rush, no desperation, no elbows digging into ribs. It felt like a store from another country, because in many ways it was. It operated by a different logic. Not socialism, not equality, but privilege, access, status. These stores weren't about feeding the nation. They were about maintaining the loyalty of those who kept the system running. Sometimes the goods didn't even make it to the shelf. A party official's driver would come by in the afternoon and pick up a prepared package, sealed and tagged, filled with pre-approved luxuries. No need to shop at all. Just sign a slip, nod at the cashier, and leave. It was quiet, smooth, automatic. For ordinary people, these stores were rumors. You might pass one on a bus and wonder what was inside. Sometimes someone's cousin, a janitor at a ministry, told stories of what he saw. But for most, it was fiction. The idea that somewhere right now, someone was buying oranges by the crate while your grandmother stood in line for 3 hours to buy buckwheat, that idea was too frustrating to think about too long. So you didn't. You folded it up and put it away. But the knowledge remained. The inequality wasn't a secret. Everyone understood that there were two countries, one of slogans and cues, and one behind closed doors, where nothing was ever missing. The official line was that all Soviet citizens were equal, but inside those guarded shops, under soft lights and polished counters, the truth sat on every shelf. Scarcity, when it becomes a way of life, does more than change what people buy. It rewires how they think. In the Soviet Union, the psychology of the grocery store was not about selection or taste, but survival. The absence of goods did not just empty shelves, it slowly emptied certainty. And in that vacuum, a strange logic began to grow, one that shaped not only behavior, but entire world views. People didn't ask themselves what they wanted, they asked what they could get. And whatever the answer was, they took it. It began with small things. A sudden delivery of canned fish, for example, might lead someone to buy 10 tins, even if they hated fish. They'd tell themselves it might come in handy, or could be traded later. A surplus of vinegar would lead families to buy 3 bottles instead of 1, not because they needed them, but because the very fact that it was available made it valuable. If something was there today, it might be gone tomorrow. So people didn't shop with logic. They shopped with fear. Fear of missing out, of running out, of not being able to feed their families next week. Hoarding became normalized. Every home had its stash. Bags of flour hidden under the bed, sugar poured into plastic containers and stacked in closets, soap bars collected and kept like bricks of gold. The idea wasn't luxury. It was defense. A personal stockpile against an unpredictable system. The kitchen pantry wasn't for cooking ingredients. It was a private warehouse. People learned to think in categories. What lasts? What spoils? What can be frozen? What can be diluted? Glass jars were never thrown away. Cardboard was folded and stored. Even string was saved, coiled neatly for some future use. This wasn't greed, it was caution. A kind of institutionalized anxiety. The planned economy taught people to stop trusting time. You couldn't assume butter would be there next week. You couldn't rely on the milkman or the bread schedule. Even official announcements felt hollow. So you acted preemptively. You bought things you didn't need because one day you might. Or someone else might. Because in the shadows of the shortage, barter quietly flourished. You might not need those extra cans of peas, but someone else might trade for them. Suddenly, groceries weren't just groceries. They were currency. And then there was the sense of pride, not in having, but in finding. People told stories of their best catches the way others might speak of vacations. I found bananas at the Metro kiosk. There was real sausage at the back of store number 8, but only for 5 minutes. There was prestige in being the one who knew, the one who heard the rumor first. Gossip became intelligence. A tip about toilet paper was more valuable than any political headline. The street became an unofficial newswire of scarcity and surplus. Over time, this mindset seeped into deeper layers of life. People became secretive. They didn't reveal what they had. They kept quiet about their sources. Mistrust grew in the spaces between supply and demand. Even neighbors, once close, learned to compete in silence. A society built on collectivism slowly gave way to a quiet individualism. Not political, but practical. In the face of constant shortage, everyone had to fend for themselves. The planners had drawn up charts. They had predicted consumption, drafted quotas, and promised balance. But what they couldn't account for was the emotional toll of living without choice. The state tried to shape economics. Instead, it shaped psychology. A population trained not to expect, not to desire, not to plan, but simply to wait and react. Not citizens, but survivors. By the late 1980s, the illusion could no longer hold. What had once been tolerable dysfunction turned into something closer to decay. Shelves that used to offer at least the appearance of supply now sat bare for days, sometimes weeks. People wandered through stores not to shop, but to confirm what they already knew. There was nothing. Even the absurd constants began to vanish. No more mustard. No more pickled fish. Not even canned peas. The silence in those stores was different now, heavier, more final. It wasn't just about shortage anymore. It was about collapse. The ruble lost meaning. Prices changed faster than people could count their coins. One day a carton of eggs cost one amount, the next day double. The day after that, it was gone altogether. Inflation swelled not just in numbers, but in daily conversations. People joked bitterly that their salaries were enough to buy a pair of shoelaces, but not the shoes. Everyone carried bundles of money in worn wallets that felt emptier with each transaction. But it wasn't money that determined your survival anymore. It was coupons. The government reintroduced rationing in a quiet panic. Printed cards with numbers, boxes to be stamped. Sugar, bread, butter, matches. You couldn't buy without one, even if you had the cash. The idea was to ensure fairness, to prevent chaos. But all it did was formalize the scarcity. Now, everyone had proof, stamped, signed, and official, that they were standing in line for something that barely existed. Entire families organized themselves around these coupons. Grandmothers held them like medals. Mothers kept them in kitchen drawers next to gas bills and prayer cards. And still, people waited. Lines wrapped around city blocks. Men leaned against frozen walls in silence. Women chatted in low voices about politics, hunger, rumors of reform. Some stores began implementing ticket systems to prevent riots. Police were stationed nearby, not for security, but for deterrence. There was no violence, just exhaustion. The image became iconic. A woman stands beside a shopping cart, the old metal kind with one broken wheel and a bent frame. Inside, a loaf of bread, a tin of Sprats, maybe a piece of candy wrapped in paper. Nothing else. Not because she didn't want more, but because there was no more. Around her, other carts stood just as empty. People leaned on them like canes. The cart wasn't a symbol of abundance. It was a monument to what never arrived. The party no longer offered slogans. Speeches became nervous. The old promises of socialism's inevitable triumph began to sound more like apologies. Television showed factory tours and patriotic songs, but no one watched. People were too busy trying to find soap, to call in a favor, to cut a line. Even the elite stores began to falter. Imports dried up. The guards still stood outside, but there was less to protect. In some places, food riots flickered. In others, silence settled in like dust. People turned inward, eyes down, shoulders hunched. There was no grand declaration, no announcement that the Soviet system had failed. It was felt instead in the empty bins, in the rusting meat hooks, in the bitter smell of a store that hadn't received a shipment in weeks. It was felt in the walk home, cold, quiet, with a bag that held nothing but the weight of disappointment. The Soviet Union would fall soon after, but its collapse had already played out in those stores. Not in parliaments or treaties, but in queues, in coupons, in the hollow sound of an empty cart wheeling across cracked tile. The end of an empire told not through what was said, but through what was missing.